Warm greetings, dear literature enthusiasts. I'm genuinely delighted that you're here with me today, ready to share in a journey through the world of stories, ideas, and memories that cling to us long after the credits roll. Before we dive in, I'd love to invite you, gently and sincerely, to like and subscribe, not as a transaction but as an extension of this little circle we're building together. Think of it as leaving a note in the margins of a favorite book, letting others know where to find the conversation. And just so we're on the same page, this isn't a conventional review. It's not about whether the film is good or bad. Instead, it's a deeply intellectual, theoretical exploration meant to stretch the way we see cinema itself, with a literary eye and a heart tuned toward reflection. If you've ever lingered over a novel's final page or paused at a line of poetry that suddenly felt like it was written just for you, then you already know the spirit I'm hoping to bring here. The film I'll be reflecting on today is Toy Story, released in 1995. Even saying the title feels like unwrapping something half familiar, half legendary. I remember first encountering it as a child, not with the awareness that I was watching something revolutionary in animation or storytelling, but simply with the wide-eyed joy of meeting characters who seemed alive in ways I couldn't quite explain. Decades later, when I look back, I realized that this story did something rare. It reached across the boundaries of age, culture, and even time itself. And for me, it became one of those narrative touchstones, the kind you return to not for nostalgia alone, but because each viewing unlocks a new corner of your own heart. What fascinates me most even now is how the story is layered. On the surface, it is brisk and playful, full of humor and adventure. Yet, underneath, it's whispering questions that feel almost ancient. What does it mean to be loved? How do we live with the inevitability of being replaced? Is our identity tied to what we do for others? Or is it something we carry within ourselves, even when no one is looking? These questions are dressed up in bright colors, plastic toys, and cheerful music, but they're questions literature has wrestled with since the beginning. When I watch the story unfold, I don't just see toys in motion. I see echoes of Shakespeare's meditations on jealousy, of Dostoevsky's tangled explorations of belonging, even of the existential uncertainties that Sartre or Camus might have smiled at. The overview, if we're speaking plainly, is straightforward. This is the tale of a community of toys who live for the love of their owner, who measure their worth by his attention, and who confront the crisis of change when a new arrival threatens the old order. But reducing it to that is like describing the Odyssey as a man trying to get home. It's technically correct, yes, but what makes it timeless is the heartbeat beneath the summary. The toys are not just toys. They are metaphors for us, for the way we cling to meaning, for the way we navigate the fear of obsolescence. Watching them is watching ourselves, sometimes at our best, sometimes at our most fragile. I can still recall my first viewing vividly. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, barely breathing during the chase sequence near the end. I wasn't yet old enough to name the feeling, but what struck me was the sheer courage of two characters who couldn't have been more different, finding a way to leap, quite literally, into trust. As an adult, I returned to that moment differently. It's no longer just an action scene. It's an allegory for the faith we place in one another, even when the world insists we're rivals. I felt that in my own life, too, in moments of friendship where envy and admiration collided, and I had to choose whether to shrink or grow. The plot, if we peel back the details without drowning in them, begins in a familiar place. A room filled with toys, all of them loyal to their boy, Andy. Life has an order, a rhythm, and at its center is the steadfast figure of the cowboy who has always been first in Andy's heart. Then comes the rupture. A gift, sleek and modern, brimming with features the cowboy lacks. The room tilts, loyalties shift, fear blossoms. What follows is a story of rivalry, misunderstanding, exile, and eventual reconciliation. Yet even this summary, brisk as it is, feels insufficient. Because the real twists are not in the plot alone, but in the way the narrative toys with our sympathies. One moment we are laughing at the ridiculousness of jealousy. The next we are uncomfortably aware of how much we, too, crave to be chosen. There's a moment I want to linger on, without giving away every beat. It's when the once-adored cowboy finds himself no longer the unquestioned favorite, and that shiver of displacement runs through him. I felt it deeply, not because I've ever been a toy, of course, but because I've been human. I know what it is to feel replaced, to see someone newer, brighter, more capable step into a space I thought was mine. And I suspect many of you do too. That's what makes the film ache in unexpected ways. It isn't about toys at all. It's about us, about the fragility of belonging. Another twist worth teasing is the unlikely transformation of the shiny newcomer. What begins as arrogance, as an inability to see himself as anything less than a hero, collapses into the realization that he, too, is finite. That realization is devastating to him, and yet it's also the beginning of his freedom. I remember watching that scene as a child and feeling confused. Why would someone so strong break down so utterly? Only later, much later, did I understand. He was mourning the loss of an illusion. And isn't that something we all go through sooner or later? The day we discover we are not infinite, not invincible, not immune to change. It's this weaving of laughter and ache, of humor and philosophy, that makes the story linger long after. And it's why I return to it again and again, even now, not as a casual distraction but as a text to be read, reread, and analyzed. The toys become stand-ins for our own anxieties and triumphs. The bedroom becomes a stage for questions of loyalty, purpose, and mortality. And the adventure, while entertaining, is also an education, one that literature lovers will recognize immediately. I think, too, of how the film speaks to friendship. At first, the cowboy and the newcomer cannot see each other as anything but enemies. Yet through misadventures and accidents, they are forced to look past their roles, past their pride, and toward something larger. Survival, cooperation, trust. That arc feels both ancient and urgently contemporary. In Homer, in Austen, in Morrison, we see the same pattern. Rivals becoming allies, strangers finding kinship, pride softening into humility. Watching it unfold here, in a medium meant for children, I find myself strangely moved, because it reminds me that stories don't have to be labeled as adult or childish to carry truth. They just have to be honest. There's a personal note I want to share, if you'll allow it. When I first watched the film, I was young enough to believe that my toys did, in fact, have secret lives. I would sometimes whisper to them before bed, or set them in particular positions so they could see each other. The story, in that sense, validated a world I already half believed in. But as an adult, when I revisit it, the resonance has shifted. Now it speaks less to my childhood imagination and more to my adult fears, about being forgotten, about being outgrown, about finding my place in a world that keeps moving forward. That's the genius of it. It grows with us. The same narrative that once thrilled me as a child now consoles and challenges me as an adult. So as we continue in this reflection, think of it less as a review and more as a conversation between me, you, and the film itself. Let's treat it as literature, with all the nuance, complexity, and emotional honesty that entails. Let's ask not only what happens, but why it matters. Why it still matters nearly 3 decades later. And let's carry forward the questions it leaves us with. What does it mean to matter? What does it mean to belong? And how do we find friendship, not in spite of our differences, but because of them? There's a certain magic in beginning at the beginning, isn't there? Not rushing ahead, not skipping over the small details, but letting the world open up in its own rhythm. That's how I remember encountering this story. Not in a single breath, but in a gradual awakening. We step first into a child's bedroom, a space cluttered with imagination, where blocks and posters and crayons blur into the backdrop of daily play. At first glance, it seems ordinary. Yet, as the camera of memory lingers, the room reveals itself to be alive. This is where we meet them, not through introductions or explanations, but through the quiet, mischievous stirring of objects that should be still. The cowboy, with his stitched smile and well-worn hat, takes his place naturally as leader. There's no question, no hesitation. The others look to him instinctively, the way friends look to a guide who has earned their trust not through power, but through familiarity. His voice is steady, his authority calm. I can still recall the warmth that spread through me the first time I realized he wasn't just a plaything. He was someone to believe in. The first movements are subtle, playful. A meeting is called, as though this tiny kingdom runs on order and structure just as any human society might. The toys gather, their personalities sparking against one another in small but vivid ways. There's the loyal dog with a spring for a body, bounding with energy. There's the cautious dinosaur whose roar is more timid than terrifying. There's the sarcastic piggy bank, all sharp wit and humor. Each one feels instantly familiar, like people you've always known, and perhaps that's part of the charm. These toys are us, with all our quirks and flaws exaggerated, softened, and made lovable. The announcement that follows is simple. The boy, their boy, is having a birthday party. The timing is sudden, moved earlier than expected. I remember, even as a child, feeling a small twist of tension in that moment. Birthdays mean gifts. Gifts mean new toys. And new toys, well, they mean change. Even before the words are spoken aloud, you can sense it ripple through the room like a chill. What if someone new arrives? What if the boy's affection shifts? The cowboy reassures them, of course. He says they have nothing to worry about, that their boy will always care for them. And in that reassurance, I hear echoes of the things we tell ourselves when life threatens to move on without us. Don't worry, you'll still matter. You'll still belong. The party begins downstairs, unseen but audible. The thrum of children's voices, the tearing of wrapping paper, the delighted gasps. Upstairs, the toys tremble, straining to hear what new arrivals might emerge. They've set up reconnaissance, a clever little mission involving walkie-talkies and a soldier's regiment of green plastic army men who descend the stairs with military precision. The detail always struck me. How the story takes something as trivial as toy soldiers and gives them agency, purpose, dignity. Watching them march down into the unknown, I felt a surge of admiration, as though I were witnessing a genuine act of bravery. The reports come in, board games, pajamas, nothing threatening yet. The toys upstairs cheer, relieved. But then, just as the anxiety seems to subside, the moment of truth arrives. The boy has received something different, something more. The report is garbled, static-filled, but the reaction it provokes is unmistakable. Excitement, awe, confusion. The cowboy, steady as ever, tries to maintain composure. But beneath the calm, a storm is brewing. When the newcomer finally appears upstairs, it's as if the room itself shifts on its axis. He is sleek, modern, confident, brimming with features no other toy can boast. Flashing lights, wings that spring open, a voice box that speaks lines of adventure. He doesn't enter quietly. He claims space without hesitation, as though he's been destined for this room all along. The other toys flock to him instantly, drawn like moths to a flame. They marvel at his gadgets, his polished design, his very presence. For the first time, the cowboy feels something unfamiliar, something sharp and uncomfortable. Jealousy. I remember the pang I felt watching that unfold. As a child, it was just a funny rivalry, but as an adult, it feels achingly real. Haven't we all, at some point, watched as someone new walked into a space we thought was ours and suddenly made us feel small? It's the ache of being overshadowed, the sting of realizing that others might prefer the newcomer's shine to our steady, weathered familiarity. The cowboy masks his unease with politeness, but it's clear. His world has tilted. The newcomer, meanwhile, is blissfully unaware. He doesn't see himself as a toy at all. He believes he's a real space ranger, on a mission to defend the galaxy. This delusion, both comedic and tragic, creates an immediate contrast. Where the cowboy knows he's a toy and embraces it, the newcomer cannot imagine being anything less than extraordinary. I found myself torn between amusement and pity. How often do we cling to illusions of grandeur, believing we're more than we are, only to discover, sometimes painfully, that reality is humbler. The tension between the two grows quietly at first. The cowboy tries to reassert his place, but the others are enchanted by the new arrival's gadgets and bravado. Even the boy, their boy, shifts his affection. He begins to sleep with the space ranger beside him, to scribble his likeness on notebooks, to imagine adventures where the cowboy plays a smaller role. Watching that unfold was like watching a friend fade into the background of their own life. It hurt, even though it was fiction, because the emotions were so raw. Then comes the accident? Or was it an accident? The cowboy, in a moment of frustration, attempts to dislodge the newcomer, to remind him of his place. Instead, things spiral. The newcomer is propelled out of the window, and the room erupts in horror. Accusations fly. The once beloved cowboy is now the outcast, suspected of jealousy so intense it turned cruel. I remember the silence in my chest during that scene. Suddenly, the leader was no longer leader. He was an exile, shunned by the very community he once held together. What follows is both adventure and trial. The cowboy, desperate to prove himself, ventures outside. But the world beyond the bedroom is not safe. It is vast, unpredictable, filled with dangers that toys are not meant to face alone. And yet, he's not alone for long. The newcomer, though bruised and battered, reappears. Their paths collide in a series of misadventures that strip away their pride piece by piece. There's a sequence that always lingers in my memory. The moment the newcomer confronts the truth of his existence. He sees an advertisement, a brutal reminder that he is not unique, not a hero but mass-produced, one among thousands. I remember the ache of that revelation, the way his confidence crumbled into despair. It was no longer funny, it was heartbreaking, because we, too, have moments when the illusions we cling to shatter, leaving us face to face with our ordinariness. I felt for him deeply, not because I believed he was a toy, but because I recognized myself in his collapse. The cowboy, meanwhile, is forced into a strange new role. Comforter, ally, even friend. At first, he resists, clinging to his jealousy. But slowly, inevitably, something shifts. He sees in the newcomer's despair a reflection of his own. Both of them are, in their own ways, afraid of being forgotten. Both are grappling with their place in a changing world. And that recognition, unwanted, uninvited, begins to dissolve the wall between them. Their journey takes them through dark places, literal and metaphorical. They find themselves in the clutches of a boy next door, one who delights in destruction. The room is filled with mutilated toys, eerie and unsettling, each one a patchwork of broken parts. When I first saw this, I was unsettled too. It felt almost gothic, a grotesque contrast to the warmth of Andy's room. Yet even here, the story doesn't settle for horror alone. These broken toys, once feared, reveal themselves to be kind, helpful, resourceful. It was a lesson that stayed with me. Appearances deceive, and brokenness doesn't mean worthlessness. The cowboy and the newcomer, trapped together, begin to rely on one another in earnest. Their banter softens. Their rivalry bends into something closer to understanding. And though they have not yet reached reconciliation, the seeds are planted. Seeds of humility, of friendship, of shared purpose. Watching this as a child, I didn't have the words for it. But as an adult, I see it clearly. It's the slow transformation that happens when two people stop seeing each other as threats and start seeing each other as companions. By the time this portion of the story closes, the stakes have risen. The cowboy is no longer secure in his leadership. The newcomer is no longer secure in his identity. Both are outsiders now, struggling not just to return home, but to rediscover who they are. And as they face the unknown together, their fates begin to intertwine in ways neither could have anticipated. Looking back, I realized that the first stretch of this tale is less about adventure and more about displacement. It's about what happens when the center of our world shifts, when the ground beneath us tilts, and we are forced to confront questions we'd rather avoid. Who are we when we're no longer adored? What happens when we discover we're not as unique as we believed? And how do we live alongside those who threaten our sense of self? These are not questions for children alone. They are questions for all of us, carried quietly in the corners of our lives. And that, perhaps, is why this story lingers so powerfully. The first half alone carries enough weight to stand as parable, as fable, as reflection. It asks us to see ourselves in toys, yes, but more than that, it asks us to recognize the universality of longing, jealousy, humility, and hope. And even before the second half unfolds, we feel, that the journey is about far more than finding a way back. It is about finding a way forward. It's funny how stories often turn darkest just before they begin to shine again. That's where we find ourselves now. In the uneasy quiet of a stranger's house, surrounded by broken fragments of toys that once lived whole lives. For the cowboy and the newcomer, this place feels like exile, a grotesque theater of what might await them if they fail to find their way back. I remember the sense of dread I felt, even as a child. This wasn't the playful bedroom of Andy's world anymore. This was something else entirely. A land where toys didn't exist to be loved, but to be torn apart, stitched together cruelly, repurposed for someone's fleeting amusement. And yet, amid that dread, there was something unexpectedly tender. The broken toys were not cruel. They weren't monsters. They were survivors. I can still see the moment in my memory, the cowboy shrinking back in fear from a toy with mismatched parts, only to realize that it meant no harm. The lesson was sharp and simple. Brokenness is not the same as evil. I think often of that when I encounter people whose lives bear scars, when I catch myself mistaking damage for danger. This story, in its quiet way, taught me to pause, to look again, to see gentleness where fear first blinds me. But of course, the real danger here isn't the toys. It's the boy who owns them. He is a figure of chaos, gleefully dismantling what he touches, treating lives as if they were experiments. Watching him was unsettling, not just because of his cruelty, but because of how unthinking it was. He wasn't a villain plotting destruction. He was simply careless, oblivious to the worth of what he held. And isn't that, too, a form of villainy? The unexamined ease with which we hurt what cannot fight back. Our hero's situation worsens as they realize escape will not come easily. The cowboy, once so sure of his leadership, now finds himself reliant on the newcomer in ways he never imagined. And the newcomer, once so certain of his heroism, is hollowed out by despair. He has seen himself in a commercial, realized he is one among thousands, not unique, not destined for greatness. That moment always struck me deeply. To see him slump, wings drooping, spirit crushed. It felt almost too raw for a children's film. But isn't that the mark of great storytelling? To take us to the edges of despair so that the climb back toward hope feels hard-earned, not cheap. The cowboy tries to encourage him, but not with empty words. He begins to see value in something beyond flashy gadgets and grand illusions. He reminds the newcomer that being loved, truly loved, is a kind of greatness too. This part has always stayed with me. I've often wondered, in my own life, whether the urge to be extraordinary blinds me to the quiet miracle of being cherished by even a few. What the cowboy says, what he shows, is that sometimes the purpose of life is not to save galaxies, but to matter deeply to someone, even one person. And that is enough. The relationship between the two, once poisoned by rivalry, begins to shift here. Their banter softens into camaraderie, their suspicion into trust. And with trust comes possibility. They begin to work together to scheme their escape. The broken toys, once feared, now become allies, lending their ingenuity and courage. I still feel a flicker of excitement remembering the intricate plan, the teamwork, the breathless urgency of their attempt to break free. It felt less like watching toys move and more like watching the raw beauty of collaboration, the way strangers become comrades when survival depends on it. Yet just when hope seems close, it falters. Plans collapse, time runs short, and the threat of being lost forever looms. The cowboy and the newcomer must face the ultimate test. Can they truly put aside pride, fear, and bitterness to trust each other completely? It's one thing to talk of friendship. It's another to live it when the stakes are life itself. The climax builds with exquisite tension. The boy's family prepares to move houses, boxes packed, car loaded. The cowboy and the newcomer, still separated from Andy, scrambled desperately to rejoin him. I remember the pounding of my own heart during these scenes as a child, and even more so as an adult. Because beneath the chase, beneath the action, lies a deeper anxiety, the fear of being left behind. Haven't we all, in one way or another, felt that urgency? The world moves forward, and we scramble not to be forgotten, not to be abandoned by those we love. The chase itself is spectacular in its inventiveness. The newcomer strapped to a rocket, the cowboy clinging, the chaos of motion. And then, that moment. The fall. The terror of free fall, the inevitability of crashing. Until, in a flourish both comedic and profound, the wings spring open. For the first time, the newcomer does not fly alone. He carries the cowboy with him. And the cowboy, once bitterly dismissive of those wings, can only look in wonder. I remember laughing, even cheering as a child. But as an adult, the scene has taken on new meaning. It isn't just a stunt. It's a metaphor. Sometimes we only discover we can soar when we stop trying to do it alone. The newcomer believed he was more than a toy. The cowboy believed he was only a toy. Both were wrong and both were right. Together, they found a truth that transcended either illusion. The resolution that follows is gentle, tender. They return to Andy not as rivals but as friends. The cowboy no longer fears being replaced. The newcomer no longer clings to delusions of grandeur. They have found something richer, belonging not in competition, but in companionship. Watching it unfold, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. It wasn't just that the story ended happily, it was that it ended honestly. The characters had grown, not in ways that erased their flaws, but in ways that transformed them. What lingers most for me, though, is the sense of balance the story achieves. It begins in jealousy and ends in acceptance. It begins in rivalry and ends in friendship. It begins with toys desperate to matter and ends with toys realizing they already do. That arc, to me, feels almost biblical in its simplicity, yet profoundly human in its resonance. Even now, when I reflect on it, I think less of the adventure itself and more of the emotional truth it revealed. That we are all, in some way, afraid of being forgotten. That we all long to be chosen, to be loved, to be seen as irreplaceable. And that perhaps the path to peace lies not in outshining others, but in learning to share the stage with them. I can't help but weave in my own memories as I sit with this. Times in my life when I felt overshadowed, when someone newer or brighter seemed to take my place. Times when I, like the cowboy, feared being left behind. And times, too, when I, like the newcomer, clung to illusions of grandeur, only to have them stripped away. Each time, what saved me wasn't winning or proving myself. It was friendship. It was finding someone who saw me as enough, even in my ordinariness. And that, I think, is why the story endures. Not because it dazzles with its animation, though it does. Not because it entertains with its humor, though it surely does that too. It endures because it reminds us of something we forget too easily. That to be loved, truly loved, is the greatest adventure of all. As the credits roll, I feel not just entertained but changed. The cowboy and the newcomer are not simply toys. They are us, in all our fear and fragility, in all our rivalry and reconciliation. Their story is a mirror held up to our own. And when I walk away, I carry with me not just the memory of their flight, but the echo of their friendship, the quiet, steadfast reminder that we, too, can find belonging, even when the world shifts beneath our feet. And so, dear friends, as we close this reflection, I invite you to linger with the questions it leaves behind. What does it mean to matter? What illusions must we release to see our worth clearly? And who are the companions who help us discover that we can, in fact, soar, not alone, but together? What fascinates me most about this story, when I step back from the action and the adventure, is not the plot itself but the living souls that inhabit it. Not literal souls, of course, for these are toys, stitched and molded, dependent on the imagination of a child. And yet, through the alchemy of storytelling, they breathe, they speak, they ache and rejoice. They mirror us in ways that are sometimes funny, sometimes startling, and sometimes painfully raw. To analyze them is not to dissect lifeless dolls, but to reflect on pieces of ourselves refracted through plastic and fabric. Let me begin with the cowboy, the steadfast figure whose stitched grin hides an ocean of insecurities. On the surface, he is the leader, calm, collected, almost paternal in his devotion to the other toys. There's something deeply reassuring about him at first. He has the kind of authority that doesn't need to shout, the kind that comes from routine, from years of familiarity. Everyone looks to him not because he demands it, but because they've always done so. That continuity, that predictability, makes him feel safe. And yet, beneath the calm surface, he is fragile. The arrival of someone new cracks open that fragility with frightening speed. Watching his jealousy unfold is uncomfortable precisely because it is so human. He doesn't erupt at once. Instead, he simmers. He masks his unease with politeness, then with half-hearted jokes, and finally, when the threat becomes undeniable, he lashes out in ways he barely recognizes. I remember feeling unsettled by this shift when I first watched the story. Leaders are supposed to be strong, unshaken. But here was a leader unraveling in real time, undone by envy. And yet, I admire him for that very reason. Because in his unraveling, he becomes real. He shows us that leadership doesn't mean immunity to fear. It doesn't mean perfection. It means stumbling, sometimes badly, and then finding the courage to grow. His greatest achievement is not holding the group together at the beginning. It is learning to hold himself together after being cast out. And that, I think, is a lesson more valuable than any tidy portrayal of a flawless hero. Then there is the newcomer. Shiny, dazzling, bursting onto the scene with the arrogance of someone who doesn't yet know his own limits. His belief that he is a space ranger on a mission to protect the galaxy is both absurd and endearing. Absurd because we can see plainly that he is a toy. Endearing because his delusion comes from a place of innocence. He is not boastful in malice. He is simply unable to imagine himself as ordinary. But illusions, no matter how comforting, cannot last forever. The moment when he realizes he is mass-produced, that there are countless others exactly like him, is devastating. His wings, once a symbol of boundless confidence, droop. His voice falters. For me, that scene always carried more weight than the grand chase or the dramatic rescue, because it is, at its core, a moment of existential collapse. He confronts the same question so many of us face in quieter, more private ways. What makes me special, if I am not unique? What redeems him is not a return to illusion but a redefinition of greatness. By the end, he no longer needs to believe he is saving galaxies. It is enough to know that he is loved by one child, that his presence matters in a small but profound way. That arc, from delusion to despair to acceptance, is a kind of miniature tragedy and triumph rolled into one. And in that journey, he becomes not just a comic foil to the cowboy, but his equal, his partner, his friend. The dynamic between these two is the heart of the story. Rivalry turning into friendship is a trope as old as literature itself. But what makes this rendition so powerful is the emotional honesty with which it unfolds. At first, they cannot even speak to one another without barbs. They circle like predators, each threatened by the other's existence. Yet necessity forces them together, and in that forced companionship, something begins to shift. They see in one another reflections of their own fears, and eventually, of their own hopes. What strikes me most is how their friendship is not born of convenience alone. It is born of vulnerability. The cowboy sees the newcomer broken by despair and offers comfort, not out of pity but out of recognition. The newcomer sees the cowboy stripped of his authority and offers respect, not out of obligation but out of empathy. That exchange of vulnerability, that willingness to admit weakness, is what transforms rivalry into companionship. And isn't that true in our own lives too? Friendship rarely begins in the glitter of perfection. It begins when we dare to show someone else the cracks in our armor. But this story is not only about the two central figures. The ensemble of supporting characters adds richness and texture to the world. The dinosaur, timid yet eager, reveals how strength is not always about size or appearance. The piggy bank, sarcastic but loyal, reminds us of the role humor plays in diffusing tension. The loyal dog, ever ready to spring into action, embodies the joy of simple devotion. Each one is a sketch of a human archetype, drawn in bright colors and playful shapes, but carrying truths that linger. I think often of the little green soldiers, descending the stairs with military discipline. To a child, it is a funny gag. Tiny figures treating their mission with deadly seriousness. But to me, now, it is a metaphor for dignity. Even the smallest, most overlooked among us can carry themselves with purpose. Their march is comical, yes, but also strangely noble. And I find myself asking, how often do we dismiss the seriousness with which others approach their own small tasks, forgetting that what seems trivial to us might feel monumental to them? And then there are the broken toys in the neighbor's house. At first, they are framed as monstrous, stitches and mismatched parts making them appear grotesque. The cowboy and the newcomer recoil in fear, and I remember recoiling too. But slowly, the truth is revealed. They are kind, resourceful, even heroic. That reversal is brilliant in its simplicity. It asks us to confront our own biases, our instinct to equate brokenness with danger. I cannot count how many times I've returned to that lesson in my own life, catching myself fearing what is different, only to discover that difference hides unexpected grace. The antagonist of the story, if we can call him that, is the boy who destroys toys. He is a figure of cruelty, but not of calculated malice. His evil is casual, careless. He doesn't pause to consider that the objects he tears apart might have worth. And in that way, he becomes a chilling reflection of how indifference can wound as deeply as intention. To me, he represents not just the danger of cruelty, but the danger of apathy, the ease with which we can cause harm simply by failing to see the value in what surrounds us. Together, these characters form a tapestry that feels far richer than its surface suggests. They are not merely toys in motion. They are archetypes, reflections, metaphors for the ways we live and struggle and grow. The cowboy embodies the fragility of leadership and the courage of humility. The newcomer embodies the pain of shattered illusions and the beauty of acceptance. The supporting cast embodies the diversity of human traits, loyalty, humor, fear, devotion, all woven together into a community that, like any community, is flawed but enduring. When I think about why these characters linger so strongly in memory, I realize it's because they do not exist only in the story. They exist in us. I have been the cowboy, clinging to my role, fearing replacement. I have been the newcomer, convinced of my own grandeur until reality brought me crashing down. I have been the timid dinosaur, the sarcastic pig, even the broken toy mistaken for dangerous. Each one is a fragment of my own humanity, disguised in plastic and fabric but recognizable all the same. And perhaps that is the genius of it. The story doesn't simply give us characters to watch. It gives us mirrors to hold. Mirrors that reflect our jealousy, our hope, our resilience, our brokenness. Mirrors that remind us that even in our most ordinary moments, we are worthy of love, of belonging, of friendship. So when the cowboy and the newcomer finally clasp hands, not literally, but in spirit, it feels like more than a reconciliation between two rivals. It feels like a reconciliation within ourselves. A reminder that we are both fragile and strong, both ordinary and extraordinary, both fearful and brave. And in that paradox lies the beauty of being human. What always amazes me about stories, especially those that carve themselves so deeply into culture, is how the magic we see on screen is only half the tale. The other half lives in the shadows, the strange little decisions, the accidents, the stubborn arguments, the unlikely inspirations that shape the final work in ways no audience could imagine. And in this particular case, that hidden half is filled with oddities so peculiar, so unexpected, that they almost feel like legends whispered around a campfire. One of the strangest things, for me, is how precarious the whole project once was. We look back now and see a triumph, a pioneering achievement that feels inevitable in hindsight. But at the time, the studio was barely holding its ground. Their partnership with the giant distributor wasn't a smooth marriage of equals. It was a tug of war, a delicate balance where one wrong step could have ended everything. In fact, the earliest drafts of the film were so poorly received that the project was almost scrapped entirely. Can you imagine that? This story we now treasure as a cultural landmark nearly didn't exist. Not because of technical limitations, but because the early versions felt mean-spirited, almost cruel. The cowboy character, for example, was once far harsher, sarcastic to the point of being unlikable. Executives looked at him and thought, "No child will love this." And for a while, it seemed they were right. What saved the film was not a simple rewrite, but a philosophical shift. The creators realized that for the magic to work, the characters had to feel human in their vulnerabilities, not just witty in their banter. It was this shift that softened the cowboy's edges, that gave the Space Ranger his naive optimism, that turned rivalry into something deeper. When I learned this, I couldn't help but marvel. How many works of art are born not out of perfect vision, but out of mistakes that force the creators to dig deeper? It's almost comforting, really, to know that brilliance often grows from the soil of near disaster. Another fact that has always struck me as wonderfully strange is the sheer risk of making the entire film with computers. Today, we take computer animation for granted. Our screens are filled with digital landscapes, photorealistic animals, impossible worlds. But back then, no one had done it. Not like this. Animations had used computers here and there, for certain effects or brief sequences, but never had an entire feature-length story lean so heavily on machines. And the technology wasn't ready in any comfortable sense. Rendering even a few seconds of footage took hours, sometimes days. The computers overheated. Files corrupted. At one point, a catastrophic error nearly wiped the entire project from existence. Months of work gone in the blink of an eye. The strangest part? It was saved not by a backup system, not by a studio intervention, but by chance. One of the animators happened to have a copy of the files on her personal computer at home, a sort of unofficial backup she had made just in case. Without her foresight, without that almost casual act of duplication, the world might never have seen the story at all. Think about that. One person's small decision preserved a cultural landmark. Whenever I recall that, I find myself thinking of all the hidden hands, the unsung acts of preservation that keep the things we love alive. And speaking of technology, the sheer limitations of the time forced some fascinating choices. Human characters, for instance, were notoriously difficult to animate convincingly. The skin textures, the movements, the expressions, they often looked unsettling, falling into what we now call the uncanny valley. To solve this, the creators cleverly minimized how often humans appeared. The story focused on the toys instead, whose plastic forms were far easier to render convincingly. What could have been a crippling weakness became a narrative strength. It reminds me of something I once heard. Art often thrives on restriction. When you can't do everything, you're forced to do something remarkable with what you have. The voice casting, too, carries its share of strange tales. The choice for the cowboy's voice seems obvious now, warm, commanding, with just enough humor to soften authority. But originally, different actors were considered, voices that would have given him entirely different shades of personality. The Space Ranger, too, could have been someone else entirely. Various names floated through the air, and the tonal shift each would have brought fascinates me. I imagine the Ranger voiced with a heavier, more serious timbre, less comic, more heroic, and wonder if the balance with the cowboy would have shifted into something colder. It makes me grateful, almost oddly so, for the casting decisions that were finally made. Because when you hear those voices, it's not just acting, it's identity. Then there's the strange trivia that peppers the film like little winks from the creators. The license plates, the names etched on objects, the hidden references to the studio's earlier shorts, all of them tiny signatures, reminders that behind the gloss of storytelling are real people leaving breadcrumbs for those willing to look closer. One plate, for instance, carries the number of a classroom that once shaped the director's life. Another object bears the name of a child born to one of the animators. These details, invisible to most viewers, are deeply personal to the people who made them. It's as though they were building not just a film, but a time capsule of their own lives, buried within the pixels for future generations to stumble upon. And of course, there's the oddity of the neighbors' toys, the broken, mismatched figures who appear so monstrous at first. Their designs weren't purely the product of imagination. They were partly inspired by the real play habits of children observed during research. Kids, it turns out, have a natural tendency to mix and match, to dismantle and rebuild, to create hybrids of toys in ways that are both unsettling and ingenious. When I learned this, It made the neighbors' creations feel less like grotesque inventions and more like genuine echoes of childhood curiosity. Strange, yes, but also strangely honest. One of the funniest behind-the-scenes facts is how much the animators relied on office antics to capture movement. To understand how a toy might fall, they dropped objects repeatedly, watching how they bounced or rolled. To study walking, they tied objects to themselves and filmed the results. At one point, staff members crawled on the floor, acting out sequences with exaggerated gestures, not unlike children at play. It's almost poetic. In order to bring toys to life, the adults had to return to a state of childlike playfulness themselves. And then there's the odd history of the project's very existence. This wasn't a film born in the comfortable halls of established tradition. It was born in a studio that, at the time, was small, precarious, and uncertain of its future. Their greatest asset wasn't money or reputation. It was stubbornness. They believed, perhaps foolishly, that a fully computer-animated film could work. That belief was strange in itself because no one else did. The industry scoffed, the technology trembled, and yet they pressed forward. I think often about that kind of conviction. To believe so fiercely in something no one else believes in is both foolish and courageous. And sometimes, as in this case, it changes history. What's even stranger, in retrospect, is how close the film came to being something entirely different. Early sketches reveal subplots and characters that never made it to the screen. Toys that were cut for time, jokes that were deemed too dark, sequences that felt too experimental. The film we know is, in a sense, only one thread of a vast web of possibilities. Somewhere in an archive lie versions of the story where characters behave differently, where the tone leans sharper, where the ending resolves in other ways. We'll never see those versions, but knowing they exist gives me chills. Because it reminds me that the art we love is always one choice among countless paths untaken. Even the technology itself left its odd fingerprints. Shadows, for example, were notoriously difficult to render. Some sequences avoid them altogether, or simplify them to the point of abstraction. The result is a world that feels bright, clean, almost dreamlike. Not because the creators wanted that exact look, but because they were constrained by what the computers could handle. Again, limitation becomes aesthetic. What once was a struggle now reads as style. One final story lingers with me, and it might be the strangest of them all. During production, the pressure was so intense, the hours so long, that many of the animators essentially lived at the studio. Sleeping bags appeared under desks. Pizza boxes piled up. Families grew accustomed to barely seeing their loved ones. It sounds miserable, yet those who lived through it describe it with a kind of fondness, as though it was a strange pilgrimage. They were exhausted, yes, but they were also part of something new, something uncharted. That mix of suffering and exhilaration is written between the frames. I think. You can feel it, the desperate joy of people pushing themselves to the edge of possibility. All of these facts, strange and small and sometimes unbelievable, remind me that the story we see on the screen is only half the story. The other half lives in the cracks. The near disasters, the odd decisions, the private jokes, the stubborn beliefs. And perhaps that's why the film resonates so deeply. Because it isn't just the story of toys finding meaning. It's the story of people, ordinary, flawed, brilliant people, pouring themselves into a dream so unlikely it might have collapsed at any moment. The strangeness of its making is inseparable from the magic of its existence. And so, when I rewatch it now, I don't just see the cowboy or the space ranger. I see the animators on their knees, acting out scenes in the office. I see the programmer staring at a frozen screen, praying the render won't crash. I see the writer throwing out pages of dialogue that feel too cruel, too sharp, and searching for something gentler. I see the quiet hero who kept a backup at home, unknowingly saving the film from oblivion. These shadows linger, and they make the story glow all the brighter. Because in the end, the strangest fact of all is not that the film broke boundaries or pioneered technology. The strangest fact is that it exists at all, that against all odds, against all reason, against every limitation, it came to life. Like the toys it portrays, it should have remained an object, an experiment, a half-finished idea. And yet, through resilience, chance, and a touch of wonder, it found a soul. What lingers with me most about this story are not the dazzling technical feats, not even the groundbreaking achievement of its animation, but the quiet power of its events, the little moments of jealousy, revelation, despair, and grace that ripple outward like stones dropped into the water. To analyze these events critically is to step back, not just as a viewer, but as someone who sees them as metaphors, as cultural signposts, as mirrors of our own struggles. Take the opening sequence, for instance. At first glance, it is pure play. A boy lost in imagination, orchestrating a miniature drama with his beloved toy at the center. But look closer, and you see the foundations of the entire narrative. Here, the cowboy is not just a plastic figure. He is sheriff, hero, protector. He occupies the role of authority in the boy's universe, not because of what he is, but because of what the child projects onto him. This is our first critical lesson. Identity in this world is not innate. It is assigned, conferred, bestowed by the gaze of another. Without the child's love, the cowboy would be nothing more than stitched fabric and plastic. With it, he is everything. That precarious reliance on external validation haunts the rest of the film like a ghost. The next pivotal event comes with the arrival of the newcomer. It is not simply the introduction of another toy. It is the shattering of an ecosystem. Suddenly, the carefully balanced hierarchy collapses, replaced by a new axis of attention. The cowboy, once the unquestioned center, now finds himself orbiting the glow of another. From a critical perspective, this moment embodies the anxiety of displacement, the fear of obsolescence. It is the same fear that drives industries to compete, workers to cling to positions, even friends to bristle at newcomers in social circles. And in the intimate universe of this story, it cuts to the core of what it means to matter. When the cowboy tries, clumsily, to assert his place, the events that follow unfold almost like a tragedy. His jealousy drives him to act in ways that betray his own character. The moment he causes the newcomer to fall, whether by accident or intent, is one of the most critical turning points. On the surface, it is slapstick, a toy knocked from a window. But critically, it is a moral collapse. The leader who once embodied loyalty and steadiness has been reduced to sabotage. The laughter that might accompany the scene in a casual viewing turns uneasy when you step back. Because isn't that what envy does to us? Corrodes. It makes us strangers to ourselves. The fallout from that act pushes the story into its darker phase, where the cowboy is ostracized, shamed, and abandoned. From a literary perspective, this exile is almost mythic. Heroes throughout history, Odysseus, Dante, even biblical figures are cast out, forced into wilderness only to return transformed. Here, the cowboy's wilderness is not a literal desert but the loneliness of rejection. And within that loneliness, he begins to see himself not as a leader or hero, but as fragile, flawed, ordinary. This, to me, is one of the most resonant events in the story. The moment when identity is stripped bare. In parallel, the newcomer faces his own crucible. For much of the story, he has lived in blissful delusion, convinced of his grandeur. But then comes the moment, the cruel reveal that he is not unique, that he is, in fact, one among millions mass-produced and interchangeable. From a critical angle, this is nothing less than an existential crisis. His wings, his gadgets, his confidence, suddenly meaningless. Watching him stagger under that realization, I remember feeling as though the ground beneath me shifted too. Because who among us has not faced that same crushing thought? That we are ordinary, that our uniqueness is an illusion. The event is comedic in its setup but devastating in its implications. What makes this moment so important is not just the despair it sparks, but the redefinition it demands. The newcomer eventually learns that worth does not come from grandeur or uniqueness. It comes from love, from connection, from belonging to one child who sees him as irreplaceable. Critically, this is a radical inversion of value. In a culture that often prizes distinction above all else, this story whispers that to be ordinary and loved is no less profound than to be extraordinary and alone. Then there are the encounters with the broken toys, the strange, misshapen figures cobbled together in the neighbor's house. This event, though small in terms of screen time, carries immense critical weight. At first, these figures are coded as monstrous, the other to be feared. But as the truth emerges, they are revealed to be kind, helpful, even heroic. The critical reading here is almost unavoidable. It is a parable about prejudice, about how our initial perceptions, shaped by fear, by difference, blind us to the humanity in those who do not fit our expectations. It is one of the most powerful reversals in the film, turning horror into empathy, grotesque into grace. The climax itself, the desperate chase, the struggle to return before being left behind, is exhilarating, yes, but its critical resonance lies in what it represents. The cowboy and the newcomer, once enemies, are now united in purpose. Their joint effort to catch up with the moving truck is not just about survival. It is about reconciliation, about the forging of friendship out of rivalry. The moment they succeed, aided by trust in one another, crystallizes the story's central theme, that true strength emerges not from dominance but from connection. It is, in a sense, the narrative's great catharsis. Critically, one must also note the role of the child in all this. For while the toys struggle, despair, and grow, the boy remains blissfully unaware of their inner lives. To him, they are simply companions. And yet, his attention, his love, his choice of who to hold shapes everything. This dynamic invites a provocative interpretation. Are we, in our own lives, not also shaped by forces that remain oblivious to our struggles? Forces of society, of economy, of chance? The toy's plight becomes, in this light, a metaphor for our own dependence on indifferent structures that govern our worth. Another event worth pausing on is the moment of flight, the improbable, impossible soaring into the sky near the story's end. Rationally, it makes no sense. The physics are absurd, the mechanics fantastical. And yet, emotionally, it resonates with a purity that logic cannot touch. Critics have long debated whether such a moment undercuts the realism painstakingly built throughout the film. But I think it does the opposite. It lifts the narrative into the realm of myth, where impossibility becomes the language of hope. It tells us that in friendship, in unity, we might just defy the laws that constrain us. Not literally, of course, but spiritually. From a broader critical perspective, these events together form a tapestry of themes that ripple outward. The anxiety of being replaced, the collapse of illusion, the redefinition of value, the prejudice against difference, the redemption through friendship. Each event carries not just narrative weight but philosophical resonance. And when audiences responded so powerfully to the film, it was not only because they were charmed by talking toys. It was because, on some level, they recognized themselves in these events. They saw their own jealousy, their own fears, their own longing for acceptance mirrored back at them. It is also worth noting how these events were received in their cultural context. At the time, society was teetering on the edge of a digital revolution. Questions of identity, of obsolescence, of being replaced by newer, shinier models were not confined to toys. They were pressing anxieties in workplaces, in communities, in families. The cowboy's fear of being cast aside by a new arrival echoed the fears of countless workers facing automation, globalization, rapid change. The newcomer's collapse upon realizing he is not unique mirrored a generation grappling with mass production, mass media, the erosion of individuality. The events of the story, though playful in form, carried the weight of cultural allegory. And perhaps this is why the film's emotional resonance endures. Because these events are not bound to a particular time. They are archetypal. They speak to the perennial human condition, the longing to be chosen, the fear of being forgotten, the struggle to find meaning in ordinariness. Each time I return to the story, I find myself caught again by some small detail, some moment that feels suddenly sharper, suddenly more relevant. The true critical power of these events lies not just in their construction, but in their ability to hold contradictions. The cowboy is both leader and saboteur, noble and petty. The newcomer is both deluded and endearing, shattered and redeemed. The broken toys are both grotesque and kind. Even the child is both loving and oblivious. These contradictions are not flaws, they are the very fabric of truth. Because life itself is a tangle of contradictions, and any story that dares to hold them honestly feels richer, deeper, more human. So when I reflect on the events of this film, I see more than a series of plot points. I see a meditation on what it means to be human, disguised in the form of toys. I see a story that dares to suggest our worth is not in what makes us extraordinary, but in how we are loved. I see a narrative that critiques our prejudices, our envy, our illusions, while offering a vision of grace, friendship, and redemption. And I see, most of all, the reminder that even in the smallest events, in a toy falling out of a window, in a revelation of mass production, in a moment of impossible flight, there are truths that echo far beyond the screen. When I think about the making of this film, I don't see it as a clean timeline of milestones neatly checked off on a studio calendar. No, what I picture is something far messier, far more human. A room filled with exhausted animators sleeping under desks, a programmer with their head in their hands as the render crashes again, a writer crossing out entire pages of dialogue because the character feels wrong, and somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, a spark of laughter that reminds everyone why they're there. The production of this story was not simply a technical achievement. It was a lived experience, a pilgrimage, full of strange turns and unlikely saves. The most striking thing about this project is how unlikely it was from the very beginning. Nobody, at that time, believed an entirely computer-animated feature film could work. Animation was still largely hand-drawn, a craft with deep traditions, rich textures, and long histories. Computers were, at best, experimental tools for short segments or flashy effects. To entrust an entire feature to them seemed absurd. And yet, there was a stubborn group of dreamers who believed otherwise. They believed in the strange possibility of silicon and code carrying the weight of human storytelling. That belief itself was the first miracle. But miracles, as it turns out, are expensive. The studio was small, its resources thin, and every decision felt like a gamble. The partnership with a larger distributor gave them oxygen, but it also brought tension. Executives expected wit, sharpness, marketable humor. The creators, on the other hand, wanted warmth, vulnerability, a story about friendship and belonging. At one point, early drafts leaned so heavily into sarcasm and edginess that the film almost collapsed. The cowboy came across as bitter, the space ranger as ridiculous, the whole tone too cynical to charm anyone. The distributor nearly pulled the plug. Imagine that the world's first fully computer-animated feature might have been buried not by technical failure, but by tone. It was only after a kind of collective reckoning that the direction shifted. The writers, the directors, the producers sat together and asked themselves, what do we actually want to say? Do we want cleverness or do we want heart? That question reshaped everything. The cowboy softened. The space ranger gained sincerity. The rivalry became not just slapstick but something deeper, something human. It fascinates me how close the story came to being something meaner, sharper, and how lucky we are that it became, instead, something generous. Behind the scenes, the work was grueling. Computers in the early 90s were not sleek, powerful machines. They were temperamental beasts. Rendering a single frame could take hours. Rendering a sequence of seconds took days. And the machines were prone to crashing. One infamous story still makes me laugh nervously. During production, a catastrophic command was accidentally entered that began deleting the film's files. Entire sequences, painstakingly built over months, vanished in moments. Panic erupted. Backups, they thought, would save them, until they discovered the backups hadn't been functioning properly. The project, years of work, was on the verge of annihilation. And then, like something out of a fable, salvation came from an unlikely source. One of the technical directors, working from home, happened to have a personal copy of the files on her machine. That accidental backup, that tiny act of foresight, saved the film. Without it, the world might never have seen these toys at all. I can't help but dwell on that story. It's funny in hindsight, but at its core, it's profound. Think about how many things we love. Films, books, relationships, even lives, hang by such fragile threads. A backup here, a kind word there, a decision made almost casually, and suddenly history takes a different turn. This film exists not because of invincible technology or flawless planning, but because of one person's habit of making copies. There's something deeply human in that fragility. The animators themselves had to invent as they went. There was no roadmap, no established pipeline for an all-digital feature. Every problem was new. How does plastic reflect light? How does cloth fold? How do shadows fall without overwhelming the computers? The solution was often compromise. Plastic characters were easier to render convincingly than humans, which is why the toys became the focus. Human characters were minimized, their appearances brief, their details simplified. What could have been a limitation turned into an aesthetic choice, one that made the toys world feel all the more vibrant. This is what I love most about production stories. How weaknesses transform into style. Even the way toys moved required study. Animators tied objects to their arms, crawled on the floor, dropped dolls from desks to watch how they bounced. Adults, highly trained professionals, spent hours acting like children, rediscovering the physics of play. I find that beautiful because in order to bring toys to life, they themselves had to become playful again. The film, in some sense, was created not by cold machines, but by adults willing to remember what it felt like to be a child. The voice recordings are another layer of magic. The choice of actors seems obvious now, almost inevitable. But in truth, they were the result of long debates and alternate visions. The cowboy needed warmth, humor, authority, someone who could sound paternal without being stiff. The space ranger needed confidence bordering on arrogance, yet still tinged with innocence. Different names floated in and out, and each would have given the story an entirely different tone. When the final casting decisions were made, something clicked. Those voices didn't just perform, they defined the characters. Even now, I cannot imagine them any other way. And yet, somewhere in some forgotten archive, there are recordings from auditions that could have changed everything. That thought always fascinates me. How thin the line is between the familiar and the unimaginable. Production also had its playful quirks. Animators slipped inside jokes into backgrounds. License plates bearing the numbers of college classrooms, hidden nods to earlier short films, references only insiders would notice. These Easter eggs, invisible to most audiences, served as little winks from the crew. A reminder that behind the vast machinery of production were real people, leaving their fingerprints in the work. Some of those inside jokes have since become traditions, carried forward into future films, like a secret language between creators and attentive fans. There's also the story of exhaustion. Deadlines loomed, budgets strained, and the crew pushed themselves to extremes. Many essentially lived at the studio, sleeping bags tucked under desks, pizza boxes stacked high in corners, coffee cups that never seemed to empty. It sounds miserable, but those who were there describe it with surprising affection. It was, in their words, a kind of family. They were united not just by work, but by the sense that they were standing at the edge of something historic. Every late night, every crash and recovery, felt like part of a grand adventure. And then there were the arguments. Creative collaboration is rarely polite. Ideas clash, tempers flare, visions diverge. Directors and writers wrestled over dialogue, producers pushed for changes, animators insisted on details others dismissed as unnecessary. But in those arguments, something remarkable happened. The story sharpened. Conflict, uncomfortable as it was, forged clarity. I've always believed that good art is not born from harmony alone, but from friction, like stones grinding against each other until they spark. The choice of music, too, was no afterthought. The songs had to walk a fine line. Emotional but not saccharine, catchy but not frivolous, heartfelt without dragging the story down. The composer, working closely with the team, managed to craft melodies that feel inseparable from the narrative. Hearing them now, decades later, I am transported instantly. That's the power of production decisions done right. They echo far beyond their moment. Looking back at these insights, what strikes me most is how precarious the process was. The film we know feels inevitable now, as though it was destined to exist. But the truth is, it teetered on the edge of collapse again and again. Technical failures, creative missteps, financial strains, even near erasure from a hard drive mishap, it survived them all. And perhaps that fragility is part of why the final product feels so alive. Because it wasn't smooth. It wasn't easy. It was fought for, clawed into existence through stubbornness, accidents, compromises, and flashes of brilliance. There's a strange intimacy in knowing these behind-the-scenes stories. It makes the film feel less like a polished product of a machine and more like a labor of love from people who gave everything they had. People who played on the floor to study physics, who hid their jokes in license plates, who argued passionately over the right word in a line of dialogue, who nearly lost it all to a stray command line. It reminds me that behind every cultural phenomenon are countless unsung moments of human effort. And maybe that's why I find myself so drawn to production stories, because they remind me that art is not magic in the sense of being effortless. Art is magic in the sense of being improbable, something that should not have worked but somehow did. And in this case, that improbability is part of the story's soul. The toys came to life not just because of computers or voices or scripts, but because real people poured themselves into the project with a mixture of exhaustion, joy, desperation, and hope. So when I rewatch it now, I don't just see the cowboy and the space ranger, the child and his toys. I see the animator pretending to walk like a dinosaur, the programmer quietly copying files onto her home computer, the composer humming a melody late into the night, the director pushing back against cynicism to make room for tenderness. I see a tapestry woven not just of pixels, but of people. And that, to me, is the most beautiful production insight of all. When I think back on my earliest memories of this film, what lingers isn't just the characters or even the cleverness of the plot. It's the spaces they inhabited. The rooms, the houses, the lawns, the dim glow of a television in a suburban living room. Somehow, those settings have stayed with me, almost like places I once visited in childhood and never quite left behind. And that fascinates me because those spaces aren't real. They're digital constructions from an era when computers could barely handle reflections or textures. Yet, against all odds, they breathe. They have atmosphere. They feel like home. It starts with the boys' bedroom. I can close my eyes and see it. Walls painted with clouds, toys scattered on the floor, a bed just slightly rumpled. There's a window that lets in the kind of warm, suburban sunlight that makes a room glow without ever feeling staged. For me, that room has always felt like an echo of my own childhood. The posters on the walls may not have been the same, the furniture slightly different, but the essence, that sense of a room alive with imagination, was identical. I remember sitting in my own bedroom as a kid, arranging action figures into little storylines, convinced they had secret lives when I left. And maybe that's why this digital bedroom feels so real. It doesn't just replicate furniture and walls. It captures the spirit of childhood itself. From a cinematic perspective, the room is more than a background. It's a stage carefully lit and framed to make toys the true occupants, not the boy. The camera doesn't hover at adult eye level. Instead, it often lowers itself, letting us see the world from the toy's perspective. That choice is brilliant because it shifts our allegiance. We're not visitors peeking into a child's world. We're participants, sharing the vantage point of plastic heroes. I've always admired that subtle trick, how a simple shift in perspective can make us feel small in the best possible way, like we're being let in on a secret. The backyard is another space etched into memory. Grass rendered not as perfect blades but as a textured suggestion of wildness. A fence marking the boundary between safety and danger. There's something so evocative about that yard. It feels like both playground and frontier. Within those wooden slats lies the comfort of the known, but just beyond them, a dog lurks, chaos brews, and adventure beckons. Isn't that exactly what childhood felt like? The thrill of knowing that just beyond your own fence, something larger and scarier was waiting? The filmmakers didn't just design a yard. They recreated the geography of childhood fear and wonder. And then, of course, there's the neighbor's house. Even now, thinking about it sends a little shiver through me. It's dark, cluttered, full of shadows. The lighting there is harsher, the colors deeper, the textures grimier. It's the opposite of the boy's sunlit bedroom. And I can't help but see it as a cinematic metaphor. One house represents imagination nurtured, toys loved and valued, while the other embodies imagination twisted, toys dismembered and abused. The contrast isn't just narrative. It's visual, architectural, atmospheric. It reminds me of the way fairy tales often use light and dark castles to represent the soul of their rulers. Here, suburban houses become symbols of two different ways of engaging with play, creativity, and care. What's extraordinary is how these settings enhance mood. Cinematography, in this case, is subtle but powerful. Notice how the boy's house is bathed in warm hues, gentle lighting, open spaces that invite play. Meanwhile, the neighbor's house uses low angles, sharp shadows, flickering lights from televisions and lamps. It's almost gothic in its menace. That kind of visual storytelling is what I admire most. It doesn't need dialogue to make you feel. You sense, instinctively, when a space is safe or when danger lurks. The film also uses transitions between spaces to heighten drama. The journey from bedroom to moving van, from comfort to chaos, is always accompanied by shifts in lighting and texture. A sunny afternoon might suddenly give way to a stormy sky, not because of weather but because of emotional tone. And it works. I remember watching those transitions and feeling my own mood shift alongside them, as though the sky itself were a character sharing in the toy's fate. That blending of emotion and environment is one of cinema's greatest tricks, and here it's handled with a finesse that still impresses me. Another setting that stands out is the gas station. For the first time, the toys are out in the wider world, dwarfed by towering pumps, lost in the vastness of asphalt. It's such a simple location, yet it's shot with such intention. The wide angles emphasize emptiness, isolation. The toys are small specks against industrial machinery, and you feel their vulnerability. That moment struck me deeply, because it captures something we've all felt. Stepping out of the comfort of home and realizing just how enormous and indifferent the world can be. Later, there's the arcade and the fast food environment. Bright, artificial lights, endless rows of identical machines, the noise of consumer culture buzzing in the background. Here, the mood shifts again. Not gothic menace, not suburban safety, but something hyper-commercial, almost surreal. The toys are surrounded by objects like themselves, yet soulless, mechanical, mass-produced. It's a commentary on scale and individuality, though it never announces itself. You just feel it in the way the camera lingers on rows of claw machines, in the way fluorescent light washes everything in a sterile glow. What I find remarkable is how these environments are animated not just for realism, but for emotional truth. Real suburban houses don't always look so warm. Real neighbors' basements aren't always so chilling. But through choices of color, framing, and texture, these spaces are heightened to reflect inner states. It's the same principle great painters use. Exaggerating certain tones, deepening shadows, softening light, all to evoke feeling rather than document fact. In that sense, the film is less about simulating reality and more about simulating memory, the way places felt, rather than how they looked. Even the vehicles, the moving van and the family car, become miniature settings of their own. Inside them, the toys scramble, hide, fight for survival. These confined spaces heighten tension, turning ordinary objects into arenas of life and death drama. I remember being struck by how thrilling it was to see something as mundane as a van rendered with such intensity. It reminded me that even the most ordinary settings can become extraordinary if you shift perspective. What's easy to overlook is how groundbreaking all this was technically. Every reflection on a plastic toy, every shadow cast across a wall, every texture on wood or fabric required invention. The team had to decide how much detail the computers could handle without crashing, how much realism was enough to feel immersive but not so much that it broke the illusion. And they leaned into stylization. The plastic sheen on toys, the simplified grass, the exaggerated skies. They were compromises, yes, but also artistic choices. And strangely, those limitations gave the film its timelessness. Unlike some hyper-realistic CGI that now looks dated, these stylized settings still hold up. They're not trying to be photoreal, they're trying to be emotionally real, and that's why they endure. There are also the little details that reveal love and care. Stickers on doors, crumbs on carpets, clutter on desks. Tiny imperfections that make digital worlds feel alive. I always marvel at that because in animation, every single object is a decision. Nothing is accidental. Someone placed that sticker, chose that shade of carpet, designed that lamp. And in doing so, They created a world that feels as messy and lived in as our own. That's the kind of invisible artistry that rarely gets recognized, but it's what makes these spaces unforgettable. Cinematography also plays with scale in brilliant ways. A toy on a bed looks powerful, framed like a hero. That same toy on a street looks fragile, barely visible against vast concrete. The camera knows when to empower and when to diminish, when to linger close and when to pull back. It's storytelling through lenses, reminding us constantly of the stakes without ever saying a word. When I revisit this film now as an adult, the settings strike me differently. As a child, I saw them as places of adventure. As an adult, I see them as metaphors. The boy's bedroom isn't just a room. It's the sanctuary of imagination. The neighbor's basement isn't just clutter. It's the distortion of creativity into cruelty. The gas station isn't just asphalt. It's the loneliness of stepping into a vast world unprepared. These layers, embedded in the very walls and skies, are why the film resonates beyond childhood. What lingers most, though, is the atmosphere, the way the film feels visually, emotionally. That's the mark of true cinematic craft. Long after you've forgotten every line of dialogue, you remember the warmth of the sunlight in the bedroom, the chill of the neighbor's lamplit basement, the dizzying scale of the arcade. These are moods, not just images, and they become part of us. Sometimes, when I'm in my own room and the late afternoon light slants just right across the wall, I'm reminded of that cloud-painted bedroom. When I pass by a dark, cluttered garage, I think of the neighbor's house. These settings have attached themselves to my own memories, blurring the line between film and life. And perhaps that's the greatest accomplishment of all. To create places so alive that they live with you, long after the credits roll. When people talk about movies, they usually talk about the finished product, the characters, the plot, the emotions it stirs. But I've always believed that the real magic often lies in the shadows, in the stories that unfold not on the screen but behind it. In the long nights of writing sessions, the heated debates over a single line of dialogue, the moments of silliness when exhausted animators break into laughter over something utterly ridiculous. For me, the behind-the-scenes life of a film is like the secret second story of a novel, unwritten, but no less important. And with this particular film, those hidden stories are some of the strangest, funniest, and most inspiring I've ever heard. One of the first things that always strikes me is how impossible the project felt in the beginning. Imagine walking into a meeting in the early 1990s, pitching the idea of making the first full-length movie entirely out of computer animation. Not just a short, not just a special effect, but an entire feature. Most people thought it couldn't be done. Computers were clunky, expensive, and limited. Yet, in those rooms, there were a few dreamers, visionaries who believed they could bend the technology to their will. And in a way, that spirit of stubbornness set the tone for everything that followed. The crew itself was an unusual mix. Artists, programmers, storytellers, and tinkerers who didn't quite fit neatly into any box. Many had backgrounds in computer science rather than film, yet here they were, suddenly responsible for crafting not just pixels but emotions. The interaction between these two worlds, art and tech, wasn't always smooth. There were misunderstandings, clashes in vocabulary. An artist might demand more warmth in a shot, and a programmer would stare blankly, asking for specific data values. But what fascinates me is how those differences eventually became strengths. Out of that friction came a new language, a new way of collaborating where art could inform code, and code could expand art. Of course, not every day was filled with creative breakthroughs. There were absurd moments, too. I still laugh at the story of animators who, while trying to figure out how toys should walk, tied actual toys to sticks and dragged them around the studio floor. At one point, someone even strapped a toy to their own arm and tried to mimic movements just to study how the plastic joints reacted. These weren't polished rehearsals. They were grown adults crawling around, playing, rediscovering the world from a child's point of view. That willingness to look a little foolish for the sake of truth is one of the things I love most about creative people. The voice recordings added another layer of behind-the-scenes charm. I think of the actors sitting in booths, scripts in hand, speaking lines that, at the time, had no animated body to accompany them. One actor, known for his warmth and humor, reportedly slipped jokes into his sessions, making the sound engineers laugh so hard they had to pause the recording. Another, cast as the bold Space Ranger, delivered his lines with such conviction that the animators later said they found themselves animating differently. His voice inspired the way the character moved. That kind of cross-pollination fascinates me. How a voice can change the arc of an entire scene, how sound can lead image, and not just the other way around. But it wasn't all fun and laughter. There were moments of real crisis. One of the most infamous happened deep into production, when a single command error began wiping out the film's files. Imagine that. Months and years of work vanishing frame by frame. People watched in horror as entire sequences disappeared. For a while, it seemed the project was doomed. And then, as if fate had intervened, salvation came from the most unexpected corner. One technical director who had been working from home still had a personal copy of the files. That accidental backup became the lifeline of the film. I've always thought of that moment as a metaphor for life itself. Sometimes survival hinges on the smallest, strangest decisions, like someone remembering to copy their work onto a spare hard drive. The stress of those near disasters took a toll, of course. The crew often worked punishing hours, fueled by coffee and adrenaline. Many practically lived at the studio. I picture them huddled around computer screens at 2 a.m, eyes glazed but spirits stubborn. There's something both heartbreaking and inspiring about that. They were sacrificing so much, and yet they spoke later of those years with a kind of nostalgic fondness. They weren't just making a movie, they were part of a pioneering family, building something